Bonjour, Kinamagian and Ireland Dishnikas, and welcome to this production of Social Studies Explorer. Today's topic, Chapter 4, Section 8, Transatlantic Triangular Trade. This topic comes with a disclaimer that it can be a very sensitive topic and should be treated delicately. This section does include a discussion of slavery, where 12 million Africans were kidnapped from their homes, sold, and shipped across the Atlantic. It's a very sensitive topic. So let's begin with our textbook for the Michigan Open book here. Some vocabulary, transatlantic, which simply means that's across the Atlantic. And when we talk about Atlantic, we're referring to the Atlantic Ocean, which is located right here. Surplus is when you have extra. We'll see also mercantilism and imports, where you bring something in. All right, so there's going to be readings, and then there are some embedded links in here that we will discuss as well. As you saw in other chapters, Africa was far away from the colonies, and traveling took a long time. So why would the British head all the way to Africa for slaves? As you read, think about why West Africa became a primary center in the global trade in human beings, and why East Africans were the main ones who were kidnapped and sold into slavery. Here is West Africa. Notice the difference in distance from here to here versus, let's say, in East Africa, in which you'd have to go all the way around the Horn and then across the Atlantic. Triangular trade route, as modeled here. Trade among the continents developed in a triangular pattern. The map below shows the basic pattern of material movement through the transatlantic triangular trade. As you can see from the map, both goods and people were moved around the world. The route the slave trade took varied slightly depending on what labor was needed, but the stops were in the Western Hemisphere, Europe, and Africa. The main purpose of the triangular trade was to make the parent company, England, money. This system of profitable, government-controlled trade is called mercantilism. The plan was for the colonies to trade the goods of which they had a surplus. The colonists would export these surplus goods to England. England would then use these goods to help themselves make money. They would in turn create products with those goods that would later be imported by the colonies. The colonies had to import from England far more than they could export. By combining this with the duties, which is another word for taxes, that England established through laws like the Navigation Acts, England was able to make a significant profit from the triangular trade. The first leg of the triangular trade was from England to Africa. Ships left England full of tradable goods. Some of these things included beads, guns, ammunition, cloth, and iron products. Sailors used these goods once they got to Africa to trade for slaves, gold, and spices like pepper. The ships from England stopped at one of 8 main locations in Africa. The map shows where these locations were. So you see that they tend to be along the Atlantic coast, along the southern reaches of West Africa, including places like Senegambia, Sierra Leone, the Windward Coast, the Gold Coast, Bight of Benin, Bight of Biafra, and West Central Africa. Up here would have been the desert, and this over here had a large amount of valuable minerals. So the first leg, south. Once the trades between England and Africa had been made, it was time for the second leg of the journey. This part involved a trip between Africa and the Western Hemisphere across the Atlantic Ocean and was often called the Middle Passage. Once the ships left Africa, they would stop in one of three main locations in the Western Hemisphere: the West Indies, Brazil, or the American colonies. Once they arrived at their desired location, goods and slaves from Africa were traded for raw materials like food, iron, fur, and lumber. Once the ships were loaded with these raw materials, they sailed back to England, where the whole process would start again. And I'll show you a link to some more details on the Middle Passage in just a few moments. The triangular trade eventually came to an end, but that would not happen until the 1800s. It only ended because of things like the invention of the cotton gin and steam-powered ships, the Civil War, and the abolition or ending by law of slavery. So our first embedded link here is interactive map of triangular trade. And that brings us to here. And as you look on this slate.com article, you can see it involves a mapping of where slave ships went over the course of 315 years. More than 20,000 voyages, 12 million people kidnapped, 2 million of which died before they even reached the American colonies. So I'm going to push play and you can see which areas they tend to come through. Right here, we're in the 1560s, 1581, see if I can speed this up a little bit here for you. Now it's going a little better. See, right now at the beginning, we don't see a large amount of ships, just a few making across. And at the beginning, it's mostly going to be the Spanish and Portuguese who had claimed the majority of the Americas. And a lot of them are going to the northern reaches of South America and Brazil, a few still making their way to the Caribbean. Places like Hispaniola, which is Haiti, the Dominican Republic, became rife with slavery. In fact, Haiti earns its independence via a slave revolt. As you can see, as we get into the 1660s, more and more are going to the Caribbean. Sugarcane being a primary product there. Each one of these dots represents a slave ship. The bigger the dot, the more humans that were trafficked by these boats. Now we're reaching into the 1700s. You can see that they're largely coming from these regions of Africa that we had just talked about a few moments ago. Slavery in North America, well, in what's now the United States, began about 1619 as far as the English colonies in Virginia at Jamestown. And it was not uncommon that slaves that had originally arrived in the Caribbean may be sold again into the American colonies. Right. 1720s here. Still coming out of Central Africa. And you could watch this all the way up into the 1800s as slavery doesn't officially end in the United States until after the American Civil War, which concluded in 1865. Although there were legal protections that were supposed to outlaw the importation of humans, but sometimes that was violated anyway. You can see here a plan and section of a slave ship. This document you will find in more than a few spots in textbooks, probably even going into your high school experience in other middle school. And the cargo was human beings. They were forced to lay or sit in very cramped areas. There was never a spot where they could stand. As you can imagine, it was a terrible, terrible place to be with a lot of sickness and putrid smells. You may recall that the journey from Africa to the Western Hemisphere is called the Middle Passage. This part of the triangular trade was the most difficult part to endure as a slave. Trip took about 2 months on a ship that rocked and rolled on the ocean waves. The captive Africans suffered greatly during this part of the trip. In fact, the trip was so difficult that many of the slaves died. Slaves that died en route were thrown overboard. Enslaved Africans were separated from everything they knew and understood, including family. They were often denied food and water. Disease among the captives was also very high. This was because these enslaved people were stored very tightly on the ship. If you notice that they put parentheses around the word stored, humans were literally treated as cargo. They had to stay there whether awake or asleep. There was no relief for their condition. Look at the picture to see what a typical arrangement of slaves would have looked like on a ship. Why do you think they would have been restricted in this way? Well, let's be honest. With free movement, the slave traders probably would have ended up at the bottom of with Davy Jones's locker. People don't tend to like to be sold. So by putting them, you get more people on, which is more money, and also kind of keeps them basically imprisoned where they can't overthrow and mutiny. Part of the reason the enslaved people were treated very poorly was fear. Sailors running the ship were constantly afraid that the slaves would attempt to overtake the ship. The sailors decided to keep the slaves on the ship from rebelling by tightly controlling their movements and interactions with one another. They were kept in small, confined spaces and not allowed fresh air, water, or nutritious food. They were placed on the lower level of the boat and were rarely allowed above deck. In the cabins, men were separated from women and children by a large wooden wall. To help maintain order and ensure contact was not made, slaves were chained and shackled at all times. Despite this, once in a while, slaves did manage to overtake a ship. If you have to go to those levels to protect yourself from the humans on your boat, chances are you're probably doing something wrong. People involved. There were 3 main groups of people involved in triangular trade. They were the sailors, the buyers, and the slaves themselves. The sailors aboard slave ships had a very busy life. On top of maintaining order on the ship, they also had to make sure the ship survived the difficult journey on the open ocean. Storms were a real and ever-present danger. Fire was also a constant concern because the ships were made of wood and fire spread quickly. Sailors also had to make sure the slaves not only stayed in line, but also stayed alive. When they arrived in the Western Hemisphere, they were paid for the amount of living slaves delivered. Once the ship landed, slaves were either taken to a holding cell or were taken to auction. Before the sale, slaves were often oiled down, cleaned, and fed to prepare them for sale. Why would the sailors do this if they just treated them so poorly during the Middle Passages? I think you already know the answer. They're prepping them for sale just like you would animals at the county fair. It's a terrible, terrible theory, and one that is kind of a little bit disturbing, even as the teacher. Once the slaves looked like they would fetch a good profit, they were taken to an auction in front of several buyers. The buyers, especially in the Caribbean and Southern colonies, were usually the farm or plantation owner or someone sent on the farmer or master's behalf, like the overseer. The slaves were placed one by one in front of the buyers, like animals or livestock. Each slave would be sold to the highest bidder. This meant that families were separated and destroyed, including husbands and wives and their children. People who engaged in this economic system of free or resident labor looked at the slaves as less than human. The last group of people involved in the slave trade were the slaves themselves. You can see already that this was not a life that anyone would choose. 10 to 15 million Africans were brought to the Western Hemisphere as enslaved people. Most were taken to the Caribbean and South America, but about 400,000 were brought to North America. The work was very difficult and the path to freedom almost non-existent. There was no consideration given to the humanity of those that were enslaved. There's another link here embedded, and I've opened that up. And this is to the National Museums in Liverpool. So this is an English website for Britain. As we know, Britain was definitely a part of the slave trade and one of the key propagators to North America. On this page, and there's things you can kind of look at on your own time. We can look at the Americas. Let's open that up here. You can read about life in plantations. It's a very important section to kind of look at, and I will link it into one of these lessons this week. We can look at the Middle Passage, which we just read about. In fact, they use the term conditions on board ships were during the Middle Passage were appalling. The space was so cramped that they were forced to crouch or lie down. Women and children were kept in separate quarters, sometimes on deck, allowing them limited freedom of movement, but exposed them to violence and abuse from the crew. This is, again, pretty sensitive material and mature material. Probably not one you would want to read to a first grader or kindergartner, but one that, as we're going through your education, you need to understand the things that we did wrong so that we can learn from those mistakes. We have reached the conclusion of that portion of the class. You should return to the Google Classroom for further details. Bumapee.